This is a follow-up live stream where I'm going to be looking at a particular book called The Second Singularity. And this book is the third in a four-book series. And a couple of days ago, I had reviewed the book, The Emperor's Quantum Computer. And yesterday, I reviewed the book, The Origins and Possibilities of Genetics. And today, I'm going to briefly introduce or review this book, The Second Singularity. Now, just stepping back, these books are all applications in a cosmology of light. And the reason why it's applications in cosmology of light is because I had written a six-book series, Cosmology of Light, that went over a framework of light where light was, or rather is assumed to be fundamental to everything that emerges in our existence. So before I get into the second singularity, a brief summary of a cosmology of light. In a cosmology of light, there is an assumption that light in its native state exists where it travels infinitely fast. And corollaries to the kind of reality that it might create if it were to travel infinitely fast. And to summarize, if we consider a thought experiment and assume we have possession or we're in a tremendously large sphere and there's a light source at the center, and if light were to travel infinitely fast, and if we turn that light source on, then light's going to be instantaneously present throughout that sphere. So there's a quality of presence that becomes apparent in that reality of this immediate presence. If something not of the nature of light were to arise in that global sphere, then it would sooner or later be overpowered by the reality of light. And so there would be a property of power that would also be clear in that reality. Since everything that arises or disappears does so in this fabric of light that connects everything instantaneously, therefore light has a knowledge of things that are happening, and therefore there's this property of knowledge that exists in this native state of light where light travels infinitely fast. And finally, since everything is connected in the nature of light, there is a harmony or a property of harmony that also exists. So we had hypothesized that there's four properties that are implicit in light that become explicit when we begin to hypothesize what essentially a reality might be like that's emanating from this state where light travels infinitely fast. But more importantly, this fourfoldness, this presence, power, knowledge, and harmony that we're saying are fundamental properties of light in this point of view also begin to animate projected layers of light at slower speeds. So if light were to exist at a native state of infinity, we know that in our physical universe, in vacuum, light travels at 186,000 miles per second. And so in a cosmology of light, there's a few levels that are due to quantization. And what do I mean by quantization? It means that there's this subtle information that exists in the native state that is somehow accumulated into a threshold quantity or into a threshold value. And once it reaches that threshold, then it can express something of the materiality in a different way than how it existed in that original layer of light traveling infinitely fast. And so mathematically, in these series of books, I propose that there's a series of quantizations whereby this subtle information or subtle properties of knowledge, presence, power, and harmony become more material and create subsequently sets of presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. That's a different source of information and possibility. And then through another act of quantization, create a vast number of unique seeds that are combinations of different elements from the four sets that are, practically speaking, infinitely large. So you have infinite number of unique seeds, which becomes a third layer of innovation or the source of information or possibility. And then there's another quantization that occurs as light slows down to 186,000 miles per second, in which the diversity of these seeds actually materializes into something that then begins a more material journey as we understand it in our physical universe. So that's kind of the framework of this idea of a cosmology of light. And when we speak about a second singularity, and I'm going to connect some of the ideas I brought up in the previous days with this book that I want to focus on today. The second singularity is called a second singularity because in artificial intelligence circles, we have already the concept of a singularity that is that intelligence becomes so advanced due to the computational ability that machines have, that the human method or to understand what's happening is left behind. And essentially, there's another kind of intelligence that emerges, which is the singularity, which control of everything as is. And so the human species then gets marginalized as a result of that. And that's the notion of the singularity. In the second singularity, I make the point that, in fact, if we consider the existence, the base of existence to be due to this emergence from a single light-based edifice, then there have already been a number of singularities that I call partial singularities that have emerged. And we're at a point now where there's a possibility for a different kind of singularity to emerge, whose power and whose intelligence would far exceed anything that an AI-based singularity could potentially create. And therefore, it's called a second singularity. But why the notion of singularity at all? And what do I mean when I say partial singularities? So, in this point of view, in the cosmology of light point of view, when that final quantization occurs, whereby the antecedent layers of light and the information that exists in a vast number of diverse subtle seeds that are not material begin to show themselves at this layer where light travels at 186,000 miles per second, then that process of quantization creates a materialization that results in what we call the Big Bang, because in this point of view, the Big Bang is a vast materialization of things that are just behind the quantum veil, that perhaps are that certainly are more subtle in nature. And there's a series of emergences. So the first emergence is, we can call it space-time energy gravity. And if we think about space-time energy gravity, then we can hypothesize that space is an arena in which these millions and millions of diverse and unique seeds can now materially begin an adventure of fulfilling or displaying whatever was inside that seed in potentiality. And so space then becomes this arena of millions and millions and millions of diverse seeds. Time, in this perspective, becomes the process of maturation by which the seed can fructify or expose or materialize whatever is inside it in potentiality. Energy becomes the process by which, or the means by which, that subtlety becomes more material, and gravity becomes the relationship between seed and seed, or seeds and seeds, that always exist in some kind of collectivity at the micro or even at the macro level. So space-time, energy, gravity have a fourfoldness, and in fact, we may be able to say that space, in this point of view, is a materialization of some aspect of knowledge that exists inside light. Time is a materialization of light's aspect of power, because there's an inevitability to what is going to show itself. Energy becomes a materialization of light's aspect of presence, and gravity becomes a materialization of light's aspect of harmony. And remember, we started off with this fourfoldness of the presence, power, knowledge, harmony, and we're saying that space-time, energy, gravity is a partial singularity that emerges post Big Bang, and it's something that then defines the overall volume or arena in which all the rest of materialization is going to take place. It's a partial singularity in this point of view because it's emerging from the one single edifice of light, and therefore it's connected to the logic of light, if you will. But in a sense, it's unaware of this connection, and therefore the idea of the singularity is that it's partial, as opposed to a full singularity where there's a complete awareness that what's materializing, or this thing that somebody might materialize, is in fact one with everything in this light edifice. And so we have a series of partial singularities or emergences that are all based on this fourfold logic. And so even quantum particles, we can think about it in terms of it being a partial singularity, and a singularity because it's emerging from the single light-based edifice, a singularity because it again is displaying or materializing the same aspects of light's presence, power, knowledge, and harmony. And for example, quarks, we may make the case that is a materialization of light's aspect of knowledge. Leptons is a materialization of light's aspect of power. Bosons are a materialization of light's aspect of harmony, and the Higgs boson is a materialization of light's aspect of presence. And therefore, it remains a singularity, but partial, because that awareness of it being one with the light from which it emanated is not necessarily there. When we have subsequent emergences, these also follow the path of being partial singularities, but are themselves a stable foundation, and the stability is provided by the fact that you've got this fourfoldness that all expresses itself and all requires all four to interrelate to create the basis of the foundation of that emergence. So whether it's space-time, energy, gravity, whether it's quantum particles, whether it's subsequently atoms that make up the periodic table, or it's molecular plans that animate any cell, there's a fourfoldness in each of these things, and that fourfoldness and the interrelation between all four aspects of that thing was implicit in light, now explicit, holding or combining with each other, is the basis of that implicit foundation becoming explicit, and therefore of light maintaining its logic of expressing a partial singularity. So when we talk about these light-based singularities as opposed to an artificial intelligence-based singularity, the important point is that there's tremendous intelligence that already exists in any emergence that is happening. So in artificial intelligence, when we say that intelligent life is substrate independent, meaning it doesn't matter what kind of matter a computation might occur in, so long as you have basic components of memory and logic and intelligence that can be replicated, and memory because you have a few states in that substrate which are stable and therefore become the basis of memory, or you have a few states that can be logically manipulated to basically emulate functions, and therefore the basis of intelligent programming. So in the current paradigm of artificial intelligence, there's this substrate independence. And by contrast, in a cosmology of light, substrate is incredibly important. And to actually sever the relationship with this single light-based edifice, or to create computational ability in something that's not connected to everything that's emerged in this single logic of light, is to, in a sense, shortchange what's possible. And that's the path that contemporary artificial intelligence is gone down. So by definition, it has to be limited because the conceptual space within which it's operating has only particular kinds of components that through an incredible amount of permutation and combination can come up with a vastness that may emulate what intelligence is, but it's not the intelligence that's implicit in a single edifice of light from which everything else naturally emerges and also naturally expresses or codifies or materializes the logic of light based on that fourfoldness that exists when light travels infinitely fast. So we're seeing that there's two different kinds of singularities. There's one which is the contemporary path we're going down in artificial intelligence that is by definition limited in scope because it doesn't have connection with a single light-based edifice from which everything else arises. And then we have this series of singularities that we just call partial singularities until such point as the second singularity emerges, that has an innate and an ever-living connection with everything that has preceded it, and therefore a different order and different type of intelligence. And the fact that the source of everything that emerges is, in a sense, that one layer where light travels infinitely fast and therefore by definition has infinite information and infinite potential, means that whatever emerges comes from that infinity. And so it can't be bounded by just some prescribed components that we might conceptualize. And so there's a different order of possibility that becomes evident when we try and continue to extrapolate this series of partial singularities that's all part of this other light-based intelligence. Now, when we talk about, or in our current view of uh, computational power, we are manipulating, in a sense, information in precise ways, or even in many, many different ways, and then seeing what permutations of information are creating optimized results based on what our goal is. I mean, that's what we may say is the current focus of artificial intelligence or the way in which it functions. By contrast, when we think about the light based edifice, that's one and that animates everything, then the notion of genetics and genetic type information becomes very important. So we naturally associate genetic type information with that information that is fundamental to ordering how things may happen at the level of a living cell. And so that information is embedded in it, in genes, in the DNA. But the point that I want to make is that there's also layers and layers of pre-genetic information. So when we consider, for example, like atoms in a periodic table or quantum particles, then there's a particular space-time energy gravity information because every component that materializes has a space-time energy gravity aspect to it. And I want to propose that the space-time energy gravity is the script in which pre-genetic information is written. And the aggregation of this space-time energy gravity script that's particular to every emergence creates this macro space-time energy gravity environment in which we exist. But the point being is that there's layers and layers of information that already exist in this light-based edifice with its emergences of singularities. But all this is kind of ignored or cast aside in the current view of, or the approach to artificial intelligence, where there's this severance between everything that existed prior to some computational basis that has been conceptualized by mind. So there's two very distinct approaches to the creation of singularities, in summary. One, which, if I just summarize it as a light-based singularities, has multiple sources of information by virtue of the layers of light that quantize more and more material information from that initial layer of infinite information. And all of this is operative in any emergence that occurs in the space-time energy gravity macro container, if you will. And there's no severance. It's all connected, and it's a question of being able to see the connections, being able to understand the connections, being able to leverage the connections in a certain way that then create progressively more advanced singularities. So that's one paradigm. And then that's a paradigm that leads to the second singularity, which is the focus of this book. And then you have the contemporary AI with its approach, where it's fundamentally severed from all that light-based intelligence that animates everything and from which everything emerges. So there's an artificial boundary that's been created, and there's a conceptualization that has occurred. And in that conceptualization, there's a finite number of components, and artificial intelligence is forever manipulating these fixed number of components in infinite number of ways, potentially, to come up with something that will always be bound in that conceptual space. And so by definition, it would be limited and not have the power that is possible in this other stream of singularities that results in a second singularity.